Alright, so I did a video on the next Switch, and I did a video on the next piece of PlayStation hardware. Obviously, I gotta round out this little unintentional trilogy I created here by talking about the next big piece of Xbox hardware, speculate on it a little bit, give some of my technical insight. However, this video is going to be a very different format compared to the other two videos I talked about, whereas those videos were about hardware that we're potentially releasing within a year, and I was just kind of guessing, just based on vibes and my technology understanding of technology. I won't have to be doing any of that because Microsoft leaked it all for me. And no, I'm not talking about that weird all digital Xbox Series X that's supposedly coming out at the end of 2024, or that other weird Xbox Series S refresh. If you've been following the United States FTC court trial about Activision Blizzard being acquired by Microsoft, you might have seen this particular slide leak out about Xbox's next generation plans that was supposedly created around May of 2022 or so. From what little context I can find on the internet about this particular slide, it is an internal presentation to like some Microsoft slash Xbox executives about what the overall kind of general design goal features that the company like wants to implement, or at least the people who made this presentation want to implement into the next Xbox console as sort of a loose pitch. Because interpreting this as anything else other than a loose pitch becomes extremely suspect. This slide is just so incredibly fascinating because I get the feeling that it's obviously created by people who understand what all this technology stuff does, but not the purpose. Does that make sense? These things would naturally all be in the next Xbox machine, yet I don't think that if you asked like any party involved in seeing or presenting this presentation, explain back like what the purpose of this is. I don't know, just having like this little like, yeah, we might use x86, we might use ARM, and I'm like, that's not just a thing you just be wishy-washy about. That's actually like a pretty significant difference, at least on like a hardware engineering kind of level, that there's like a huge difference in which one that you pick. So to see it just so casually presented, it's like, yeah, we just might go with one or the other, whatever, like just seems so strange to me. For potentially just sticking with x86, I don't really have a problem with anything. I mean, it's worked on Xbox One and it's working on the series consoles. AMD, I imagine, is a great partner for Microsoft to work with, given they work with them on a ton of other stuff. So if they just stick with x86, Zen 6, that seems the appropriate architecture for about when this console would probably launch, then yeah, x86 does seem like the right move. Obviously, you still got to put a lot of work into it, but that does seem like just a bullet point on a PowerPoint slide. Like, we don't gotta make a big deal out of this. The most interesting thing on the slide, however, is the implication of the next Xbox potentially being ARM was being discussed at some point, which, I don't know, kind of confuses me a little bit as just like a general outsider. There's really only like three major reasons that I can think of that somebody would want to use ARM specifically. Number one is that it's actually licensable. If you're not Intel or AMD, you don't have access to x86, the next best thing is ARM, that you can license it. So, okay. The second reason you use ARM is that, in general, ARM SoCs just seem a little bit better tightly integrated than their x86 equivalents. When you start throwing a GPU, an NPU, media encoders, media decoders, stuff like that, all onto like one singular piece of silicon, it just seems like the ARM ones, I mean, it's not like a super huge difference, but it definitely is noticeable and it's there. And the third reason that you'd want to use ARM over x86 is that at lower power states, ARM really, really outperforms x86 in general. That the lower the power state, especially once you get into the single digit wattage, that ARM really starts to outperform, right? Like, smartphones all use ARM. None of these use x86 because when you get to this performance class with an x86 processor, it just doesn't perform very well. However, each of these reasons seem incredibly suspect in a Xbox console context because reason number one, not having access to x86 is totally bunk. Microsoft directly works with AMD already. So it's not like they don't have access to an existing compute architecture that is capable of high performance for a game console. So let's throw that reason in the garbage. And reason number 3, low power states, well, that really only applies to smartphone tier or maybe the lower end of laptop. It really seems like, at least from my observations, that when you start scaling up the power consumption of ARM to something more like a heavier duty laptop or even a desktop tier, like as you scale up to have ARM consume more and more power, it seems like that power efficiency advantage really starts to disappear. And so I can't imagine that Microsoft would just think, hey, let's go for ARM over x86 because it performs way better at these low power states for a device that does not consume 4 watts. It's probably consuming over 100. So I guess reason number 2 would be the most logical, that since these consoles are using custom SoCs, that if you were to use an ARM one, theoretically, it would consume maybe a bit less power than an x86 one. You're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater that, oh yeah, let's go for ARM to save some power efficiency. Maybe we'll cut off, like 10, 15, maybe 20% of the power consumption. Maybe we can make the die a little smaller so we can save millions and millions on producing these kinds of things. Okay, but then you're gonna have to spend like probably about that much having to, like, on the back end software side, just get compatibility layers to work with all of the Xbox Series and One and all the other backwards compatibility stuff. So maybe you can save a couple bucks here and there when you're making them on a wafer. Another thing I'd be really concerned about overall is just ARM performance in general. I don't know, maybe this might not be a realistic concern considering this console is probably not coming for another 4 to 6 years after I release this video anyways. I'd expect certainly ARM architectures, no matter like if they're mobile or if they're desktop or server, like they significantly outperform Zen 2 in the current Series S and X by like 2028 to 2030 anyways. But would ARM provide not just an uplift, but a significant enough uplift to be considered a generational leap that we normally see in consoles, so we don't run into another PS4, Xbox One scenario? Well, based primarily on Windows on ARM devices in 2023, I ain't feeling too good about that, Chief. One subtle thing that took me a couple of reads of the slide to notice was, while the x86 portion does have an architecture listed next to it, the ARM one doesn't. So even Microsoft itself doesn't really have a good idea of a roadmap for what sort of ARM architectures from any company would potentially be relevant by the time that this console would be in full development / release. That kind of opens up a whole other can of worms here, because no specific architecture listed means maybe it's not even AMD that could be working on this. It could be somebody like Qualcomm. Microsoft and Qualcomm have this particular relationship that they've been working on as Microsoft keeps trying to get Windows on ARM working. We see a lot that Qualcomm will make specific custom processors for Microsoft products, Microsoft Surfaces, laptops, etc., etc. So could that be possible? Could it be that Microsoft is just ditching AMD to the side entirely, hanging out with their best buddy Qualcomm and letting them take the full reins over the next generation Xbox entirely? I doubt it. There's really 2 main reasons why I think Qualcomm might not be working on the next Xbox fully. First reason is that Qualcomm is being sued right now by ARM, and so I imagine any sort of like innovation on trying to get that done in the next console probably not happening. All right, so I'm not a lawyer, so I might be getting this wrong or I might be misrepresenting the whole situation, but Qualcomm bought this company called Nuvia, and so Qualcomm and Nuvia both have ARM licenses, and so Qualcomm thought, okay, with the purchasing of Nuvia, we're going to take some of their intellectual property, some of their custom designed stuff for ARM, and we're going to use it for some of our other portfolio. Makes sense. And ARM has come in and sued Qualcomm, arguing, hey, under the ARM licensing agreement that we made with Nuvia, you cannot do that. You cannot just take their ARM IP and transfer it to yourself. And since Nuvia is considered like the one company who could theoretically push ARM performance up to like desktop class performance in the Windows space. Qualcomm being sued and having their development slowed down by this lawsuit would not be a particularly good idea for Microsoft to go full in on making the next Xbox with. But the second reason just kind of has to do with everything other than the CPU itself. Stuff like I/O, the GPU, the NPU, any sort of other accelerator type stuff. It's not that I don't think Qualcomm has the goods, because obviously they've been doing a lot of integrated SoCs over the years, but it's more like the GPU aspect I'm really particularly concerned about. It's not that I don't think that Qualcomm doesn't make good GPUs. In fact, I did a video looking at my Galaxy S23 Plus, and I found that the GPU in that was actually like surprisingly good, considering like how little power it draws. But console tier GPU, I don't know if Qualcomm can necessarily make. So really your primary options are A, Qualcomm has to scale up its GPU side of its portfolio to almost like Intel Arc kind of scale here, going from like integrated, or I guess what desktop users would call integrated on a smartphone, all the way to like high class, high performance integrated graphics, like that takes up a significant amount of the die, just for a single potential client with no other returns from anybody else. Or we go back to some other GPU vendor and we try to somehow like integrate them with all the other Qualcomm IP. That second option I don't think is necessarily impossible, especially if maybe chiplet architectures get cheap enough by the late 2020s that maybe we could start like mixing and matching different companies. I think from Microsoft's perspective, they probably just want to go with one company that can design the whole SoC in-house. There's even a potential world where a theoretical shift to ARM wouldn't necessarily leave out AMD. It's publicly known that AMD was working on their own ARM architecture, codenamed K12, prior to Ryzen 1000 coming out in 2017. And that project was eventually just shelved. So clearly AMD has the technical know-how and expertise to build an ARM architecture. Now, I don't think necessarily that AMD is just going to take K12 and shove it into the next Xbox, because it's an unfinished architecture that would be 10 years out of date by the time the next Xbox would come out anyways. Now, the rest of the slide talks about stuff that I think is kind of obvious if you know your technology. Stuff like machine learning-based upscaling, better ray tracing, microparticles for game rendering and stuff. This is all stuff that has currently been talked about and around and stuff, and people are working on. And even the current consoles do some form of these things, although obviously not as good. It kind of invites my imagination, makes me speculate a little bit about the next consoles, that just the way that we talk about them and stuff. Maybe we kind of similar to how we talk about like the PS3 360 versus the PS4 Xbox One, where yes, they are both HD consoles, but they are so kind of fundamentally different in the way that they handle games, they render games, just the way that they do things in general, that there's a clear delineation in the purpose and the point. And so maybe even if the resolution or frame rate numbers don't significantly go up with the next generation of consoles, that we could see maybe a massive difference. Now, as for actually speculating about number of CPU cores, number of GPU compute units, NPU performance, all that kind of stuff, I feel like it's kind of pointless, because again, this console is probably at least a half decade away, if not more, and just speculating about things about architectures that haven't even been taped out yet. Nobody knows exactly what these things are going to be like, the design philosophies. Just seems like kind of a dumb idea. The last thing I want to touch on here makes me very, very concerned for the future of Microsoft and I guess the Xbox brand in general. That is kind of related to hardware and is just kind of an interesting tidbit. So there's been a lot of rumors floating around that Xbox might potentially shift forward the launch date of their next console. So they might launch the next Xbox generation, I guess, in 2026 instead of 2028. All the architectures will be shifted forward, yada, yada, yada. Bro, how are you going to have a console life cycle that is shorter than the average development cycle of AAA games now? This is, I guess, an attempt to do something similar to what they did in 2005 by launching the 360 a year before the PS3 to try to build up a bunch of like market share and advantage ahead of their competitor. However, I think the problem isn't necessarily like hardware based. That I don't think Microsoft necessarily trying to jump the gun is going to get them any more market share or console sold or really try to do anything in relation to PlayStation, because I think the thing that Microsoft really fails to recognize is that they don't really have any like enticing games to draw people to the Xbox platform over PlayStation. Now, Microsoft could do whatever they want. They can make the next Xbox come out in 2026, cost $99, and be as powerful as an RTX 4090 for all I care. But really, the problem that Microsoft has is never really hardware related, at least anything within the past decade. It's always been they just don't have any compelling exclusive games over PlayStation that makes consumers want to buy them over PlayStation. Microsoft just stopped putting out a lot of first party games in 2016 or 2017, and they've basically just had to go wild with the credit card and just buy a bunch of other studios in order to get like a bunch of new talent to make games for them so they could have like notable exclusives. In fact, you could argue that given Microsoft's generous multi-platform policy with a lot of the companies that they've acquired, that really Xbox doesn't have any particularly good exclusives, even with all of the stuff they've bought. That's not to say that the games that they do have are inherently bad. It's just Microsoft does not have enough stuff that PlayStation doesn't, that people will want to pick them over PlayStation. Because if you're buying an Xbox, you're just getting third-party games that PlayStation is also getting, but then you're just getting a bunch of other stuff that you don't particularly care about. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Just a little different insight maybe into hardware speculation that maybe goes a little bit more cerebral than usual. If you like this video, like. If you have any comments, just leave some thoughts in the comment section. If you want to watch more videos like this, please subscribe. If you want to help me fund my work and help fuel the kinds of videos I make here, I have a Patreon down in the description that you can fund to help make these videos happen and to make them better. Anyways, guys, that's it, and have a good day.